Hello, everyone. Welcome. Glad to be here. Excited to discuss traditionalism with everyone. So
this is amazing, and keep going, Jared. You're doing great.
all right, yeah. So we're gonna have a nice dialogue between the three of us. Myself, Jared Morningstar. We got my dear friend Esmé here as well. Always good to be talking with her. And then we got Hasan, who's facilitated this dialogue here. So I'm excited to see where we can take this conversation and unpack these ideas of traditionalism and hopefully mine some wisdom and see how we can perhaps critique, reinterpret, understand these ideas in our own time and make them as relevant and impactful as possible. At least that's my goal here with these things. So.
That's amazing. Esmé, would you like to say a couple of words by introduction? By the way, I sent you the link, the YouTube link.
Yeah, I just got it and I've shared it. So I think as a sort of necessary prerequisite to discussing tradition, we need to communicate what it actually is that we mean when we talk about tradition. Because when we say tradition in this context, we mean it in a very noetic regard. And in a sort of intellectual climate where constructivism really dominates, when we talk about things like tradition, we often just reduce them to mere social constructs, as we do with religion and a number of other concepts. We sort of automatically understand them on the terms of their functionalist definitions, as the classical sociologists would call it. But with tradition, we're not talking about something which is purely material or talking about something which is merely a social construct. We're talking about what Roger Scruton, I believe, called tried and tested answers to enduring questions. These are things which tap into a more perennial, so to speak, and eternal reality. And so when we talk about religious traditions, again, we're not talking about things which have been constructed at a sort of discursive level or human level, but we're talking about things which pertain to ultimately the eternal. And although Roger Scruton perhaps himself wasn't a religious traditionalist in the sense that in the perennialist school that we're talking about, I think his definition of what he calls metaphysical conservatism encapsulates this perfectly. It's metaphysical traditionalism. So I just thought that would be a good place to start.
That's really beautifully said. Thanks so much, Esmé, and thank you so much for the introduction, Jared. Could you say a little bit more, Esmé, about the question of metaphysical traditionalism? What does that mean to you?
So I think it's basically the principle, in my reading anyway, that there are such things as eternal truths beyond the realm of human language. And a tradition is essentially a way of bringing that eternal truth down to the level of human interaction and human life and society. So I think, not to repeat what I've already said, but tradition is very much a means of tapping into something which is much more, which is beyond what we see every day, beyond the realm of the mundane, essentially. If that answers the question.
No, that's perfect. And so the assumption here is, of course, that there is a metaphysical dimension, right, as opposed to just a physical dimension, which is a conceit that rubs materialists quite, rubs them the wrong way, right? So what would your response be, both Esmé and Jared, to a sort of materialist pushback against the notion of a metaphysical dimension?
Yeah, that's a great question, and certainly materialist paradigms dominate in our culture, both in academia itself to a certain extent, but definitely within the broader culture and within scientific institutions. So it's definitely something that we need to contend with when we're thinking about these questions of tradition. Because we're not in this, we're not in a vacuum. We're not in just a separate niche when we're discussing religion. So that's one thing I do appreciate about the traditionalists, is that they have a robust response to science, and specifically this idea of scientism, which is related to materialism and includes it in many ways. But yeah, I think what's important in terms of understanding the traditionalists and their philosophy, and how that can respond to something like the philosophical perspective of materialism is really seeing the Neoplatonic roots of this uh, worldview that they are presenting, though they are, of course, integrating many different traditions that beyond simply the Neoplatonic. But at least the way I tend to read the traditionalists is that they are often pretty grounded in a basic Neoplatonic metaphysic. So with this Neoplatonism that they bring to the study of tradition, the study of religion, uh, there is more than simply a material dimension to reality. In fact, the material dimension is in many ways the least real of the hierarchy of beings. So yeah, that's an important idea, is hierarchy. So that you have the material at the bottom, which forms the sort of conventional empirical reality we experience as human beings. But you have these other higher realms of imagination, soul, spirit, intellect, and of course, at the very pinnacle of this hierarchy is the One, or God, Atman Brahman, if you're going to take the Hindu Advaitin perspective. So immediately you have something very distinct from materialism, where materialism is a reduction to one aspect of this hierarchy. The Neoplatonism of the traditionalist really wants to preserve distinct realities, distinct levels of reality. And so to think about these sorts of things, it's not that there's these separate realms, but that reality is a continuum up from sort of pure unity at the top with God down to varying degrees of multiplicity at the level of material. And as you go up, things get more subtle. As you go down, things get more concrete. So it's if you haven't encountered Neoplatonism before, it can be difficult to initially wrap your head around. But I think that's a good place to start with understanding the traditionalists and understanding how they might respond to something like materialism.
I think also you raised the point of subtleties and the notion of perceiving subtleties. And in modernity, this is a completely alien concept, or rather, it's a concept which we have actively exiled from intellectual discourse, in the sense that materialism and scientism now dominate to such an extent that the very notion of a subtlety beyond the empirical senses is completely written off. And this is again something which, dispelling this is a very necessary prerequisite to understanding traditionalism, because it revolves on this sentiment that there are immaterial modes of perception and there are subtleties beyond the material realm ultimately.
Right, yes, and I think especially the idea of intermediate realms is particularly interesting and helpful. I think a lot of what religion has sort of decayed to in the modern period is a very two-world sort of conception of the cosmos, where you have the lower material realm, but then you have some kind of divine realm, heaven with God in it, but there's no real continuity between these realms. And I think you certainly see that perhaps the most in some kinds of especially fundamentalist Christianity. And losing this intermediate realm, which is often identified with something like the imagination, is definitely it decays a lot of the nuance of this metaphysic, and you do get into pretty difficult conceptions of religion when you have this reduction to simply two realms. This is, I think, where the new atheist critique is very much responding to, is this, oh, sky daddy up in some other plane of reality. It's disconnected, and like how what is the relationship between whatever this other realm is and the material world we inhabit, and if you lose this medium of the imagination, which exists both within the human subject and within the cosmos writ large for the traditionalists, yeah, you do have difficulty responding in terms of how is the interaction facilitated from both God to man and man to God. And so that you lose a lot of the power of prayer when you lack the description of how that could actually function.
Absolutely. And I think it's also important to note that tradition and the imaginal realm themselves have a sort of interrelationship. T.S. Eliot, for example, in his model of tradition, tradition and the, I've forgotten the name of his amazing essay, has a monograph on tradition, but tradition and the individual talent, that's it. For T.S. Eliot, his conception of tradition is very much something which dwells in the realm of symbolism and ritual and art, and a community's sort of collective conscience or collective memory, in a sense, of things like architecture and art and other and music and other sort of folk customs. These are deeply very imaginal concepts which are linking the material realm and the material society and the people within it to a higher principle through their own medium, so to speak. So in that sense, I would say that there is a very clear interrelationship between tradition and between the imagination, as elucidated so well by T.S. Eliot, but also, again, going back to Scruton as well, I think this is something which he is very in tune with, in addition to many other perennialist thinkers, which I think we should definitely discuss. Hasan, was there any figures in particular that you wanted to?
Well, no, I was just going to actually, and you sort of beat me to Esmé. I was going to, ask both of you, who are some of the major sort of traditionalist thinkers that we're thinking through, and they're perhaps not T.S. Eliot initially. I mean, these are people who wrote very powerfully from a sort of traditionalist perspective. But perhaps the traditionalists that we're thinking of with the capital T, who are some of these figures?
Right. Yeah, and there's a lot of specific terminology that comes along with these philosophers. So they're often called the traditionalists. You also hear them referred to as perennialists, as this term perennial philosophy is strongly associated with their thinking. This basic idea being that through the major world's religions, you find a core of similar wisdom teachings and metaphysics that are ultimately descriptive of the same basic reality. So some of the main traditionalists, so these are 20th century philosophers of religion, largely. The first major figure being René Guénon. He was a French philosopher, metaphysician, convert to Islam, and he was sort of the first philosopher to really consciously articulate this idea of a perennial philosophy as a self-conscious modern person, and so his work has had tremendous impact and created sort of a lineage of important thinkers in this vein of traditionalism. So following René Guénon, you have Fritjof Schuon, a Swiss philosopher, metaphysician, and likewise a convert to Islam. And his disciple then is Sayyid Hussein Nasr, our first Iranian non-Western traditionalist author who still lives today and has had incredible impact philosophically and especially within the Muslim world. And there's many other figures. Ananda Coomaraswamy is another important thinker who specifically dealt more with the Dharmic religions, though again, as a traditionalist, he's bringing in all these major world religions in conversation with one another. And then you have other important figures, Martin Lings, Houston Smith, and there, you have a sort of core of the traditionalists from Guénon, Schuon, Nasser, but then you have a number of sort of more
I would
marginal
say Lings
figures.
is also quite core.
Yeah.
And you mentioned Nasser as a disciple of Schuon, of course. Lings was also a disciple, and before, and his sort of entry point into traditionalism initially is through Guénon, which is very interesting. So he reads Guénon, and he's completely blown away by Guénon and his sort of metaphysical writings on Hinduism. And Lings sort of relates how he thinks that he should convert to Hinduism. He starts studying Sanskrit, and then he meets Guénon in person in Cairo, because Guénon was in Cairo at the time, and he requests Guénon to become his master. So the legend is related, and Guénon apparently says, he doesn't claim that position, but he says Schuon has that capacity. And Guénon actually sort of instructs him to think more seriously about Islam. And Lings, of course, is a lot older than Nasser, and he died in 2005 at the age of 95, 96, I forget. He was a fascinating figure, one of the most brilliant and saintly people of the 20th century, without question. He was a student at Oxford, he was a student of C.S. Lewis. So it's very, very interesting. And anyway, so Lings is another important, sorry to interrupt, but Lings, I think, is really very important to mention, that he's a very significant figure within the traditionalist school. Titus Burckhardt is another very important, and they're all disciples of Schuon. Interestingly, Titus Burckhardt is actually historically he's one of Schuon's friends. So then, and it's been commented that the level of humility on Burckhardt's part to be able to take a friend as his spiritual master, and this is how I'm remembering it. So Burckhardt is a very important figure as well. And you mentioned Houston Smith, another towering figure who's also a disciple of Schuon. And has had a huge impact as far as the study of world traditions, to use that somewhat problematic term. But keep going, Jared. Sorry, before I interrupted you. You were saying.
Right. So my basic point is that you have sort of gradations of this traditionalist perspective, sort of radiating out from some of these core figures, and so you get other recognizable names like Aldous Huxley, who wrote a book on perennial philosophy, which is often critiqued by some of these partisans of traditionalism as not quite being spot on, but certainly a culturally important work, and someone with the legacy that Huxley has certainly makes an impact when disseminating this perspective as well. And then you have other figures like Eliade, who are often called like soft traditionalists, who sort of implicitly have something of the traditionalist perspective without being such expositors of it as Schuon and others were. And I think this is something quite important to keep in mind, and something that is perhaps underappreciated is how this perspective has been internalized by many scholars more implicitly, and continues to have an impact in academia and broader cultural spheres, even as traditionalism and perennialism can often be seen as rather negative, especially in academic circles, where a particular like secular perspective of being removed from the subject is prioritized, as it supposedly removes bias. Yet the traditionalists would retort that to truly understand these traditions, you need a lived experience and an internal experience of the faith, of the tradition, to see how the creed, the practices, the symbolism, the community, all these things harmonize to create this whole spiritual reality that if you're simply looking at it from outside, you are going to take this very functionalist perspective, as Esmé was saying, and that is very reductionistic at the end of the day. Yeah, that's my ramble about
No, that's
Traditionalist
perfect.
Academy.
Yeah, could we
Thank you for
also maybe?
adumbrating. Oh, sorry.
No, so I was just going to maybe could we also perhaps hit on some of the key ideas that traditionalists have? I think we've mentioned in passing. I mean, you mentioned in passing Scientism, the sort of critique of the myth of progress as one of the sort of central ideas of the Enlightenment, and which sort of underwrites so much of the modern project. Well, what are some of the other key ideas?
Well, I was just going to say that it's important to differentiate between perennialism and traditionalism. So with that, it's a probably good opportunity to actually go to what is the core of perennialism. So perennialism orientates around this notion of the Sophia perennis, which is essentially the idea of a perennial truth, a perennial wisdom, quite literally. And there's also the concept of the Praesia Theologica, which is, again, this sort of primordial theology. And according to the perennialist school, every world religion, again, that can be quite a problematic term, but every belief system all over the world is essentially tapping into this one universal truth, this one theology. And any differences that appear between the different religions are usually a result of the cultural particularisms, which particularly in the traditionalist school, are considered as being very, very important in their own right. But nonetheless, these differences are ultimately subservient to a kind of a unity. And with that, it is very interesting to note this bifurcation actually between sort of perennialism as a very general and often quite watery actually concept, and traditionalism, which I'll try and very kind of succinctly adumbrate here. So perennialism as a sentiment is quite interesting because it's actually it's quite well known in public discourse. I don't know, I don't know if any of you have had an experience of sort of going to a party or something and there's some stoner and he's like, yeah, man, all the religions are just the same truth, underneath, this is quite common. And actually, in a way, you don't want to admit it, but that is sort of alluding to perennialism in some shape or form. But with that kind of perennialism, which I'm going to call vulgar perennialism, not sure if that's been used before, it's a bit harsh, but I'm going to call it that. It's sort of a very vague and quite watery sentiment, right? And it's often used as a license for the sort of pick and mix approach, which you see in the New Age. And have you heard of the expression spiritual cherry picking, right? So when you get people who are sort of chopping and changing and incorporating different bits from different religions in a very kind of kleptomaniac fashion, actually just sort of stealing whatever suits. We can talk about more of that later. However, the traditionalist school, I think is really important to differentiate that from this sort of new agey, stoner guy at a party kind of quasi-perennialism. Traditionalism asserts the same fundamental philosophy, that there is one underlying metaphysic underneath it all. However, it emphasizes the importance of particularity and of tradition and of essentially being part of an established religion and having a tariqa in Sufism, for example, or any other kind of community. And I believe it was actually Martin Lings himself who said that there's this, if you're not part of a kind of lineage or you're not part of a Sufi order of such, but of course any other religious order could also be applied to this, then you're sort of a kind of drifting, you're sort of just ebbing and flowing through a kind of vague spiritual ocean, which actually now I think of it, Al-Ghazali uses that imagery somewhere else. So that's interesting. But you need this guide, and that's very much a doctrine of traditionalism. Without that, you succumb to this sort of very vague and often very kind of undisciplined borrowing of different religions. So I hope that explains it quite succinctly.
No, that's perfect. And I mean, you've already sort of suggested this, having a guide in the context of a tradition which has its own unique practices and doctrines and things like that. Right. And by the way, someone I noticed commented on Facebook saying y'all left out Evola, Julius Evola.
Mm.
That may have been deliberate.
Yeah, that's a good point. And we can maybe come back to that later on.
I think I know who may have said that, actually.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. So in the context of having a guide in the context of a tradition, what is the kind of traditionalist critique? I mean, you've already, Esmé very succinctly and powerfully already suggested this, you've touched upon this. Maybe we can dig down a little bit more on the sort of the problems as traditionalists would have it, as far as the sort of spiritual sort of pick and mix or cherry picking or whatever it may be. What is the issue with that? And as far as the modern, postmodern subject is concerned, and maybe this actually sort of gets us to another central idea that just occurred to me that traditionalists have, which is, as far as the critique of modernity, I mean, the major critics of modernity, and that's kind of the title of our discussion today, against modernity, they identify, and rightly so, the sort of philosophical progenitor of modernity being in the person of René Descartes, who famously, of course, says, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. And I mean, that's like, it's a whole sort of complex and important philosophical discussion around that, but which I think we should talk about also. But as far as the creation of as far as the birth of the modern subject, right, who essentially, she or he is free to choose his or her own path as he or she sees fit, right, through their thinking. And therefore, why not choose what kind of resonates with me and what sort of feels right? And what's the kind of traditionalist critique of that?
I mean, I'll let Jared do more explaining, but just to say, that is this postmodernism is so crucial because it's so widespread in terms of normativity intellectually. It's very kind of standard now to have this approach, and along with constructivism. And it reminds me of what I think it was Stephen Crook described postmodernism as being a kind of cafeteria of styles, whereby you can kind of pick and choose whatever suits you, whatever combination. And this is very much reflected in this new age tendency to pick and mix. And actually, Sophia Rose Aljana has written a really great book called Buying the Buddha, Selling Rumi, which is possibly the most relevant and most up-to-date analysis of this, particularly in regard to Orientalism. And I just wanted to say also in regard to Orientalism, and I'm sure more on that later, is that particularly when it comes to Eastern religions, this notion of sort of picking and mixing from Eastern traditions is especially problematic, I think, from a Western perspective, because it's sort of an Orientalist hangover in the sense that it's extracting what one does like from the East while also subordinating what it doesn't. So, for example, taking out certain aspects of Sufism while abandoning Islam, which is surprisingly
taking the Islam out of Rumi, right? For example.
Yes, well, yeah, no, absolutely. And I mean, Persian Poetics. Have you heard of Persian Poetics? A really interesting organization which is sort of dedicating to dispelling all of this fake Rumi on the internet. But no, not to digress there. But I did just want to say that this kind of pick and mix tendency, it relates to postmodernism, but it also relates to Orientalism, and I think those are two quite sensitive and important issues when discussing any of this. But Jared, I'll let you go into more depth about the role of postmodernism and traditionalism, perennialism.
Yeah, so in terms of this idea of picking and choosing when you approach religion, it is this very individualist paradigm. I mean, what you basically have there is the individual ego, the individual rationality being this final arbiter of religion. So it comes back to this very individual kind of self that is ultimately calling the shots religiously. But what the traditionalists, and this is something I agree with them on, would say is that authentic religious tradition is meant to supersede the self. It's meant to be this program of going beyond this sort of encapsulated individual ego, because that's a lot of the sources of are human problems. That's the source of the perennial problems we face as human beings. Things like just being dominated by desire, certainly something that's addressed by all these traditions in different ways. Or fear of death, fear of destruction, cultivating virtues of love and charity that are not only personally rewarding, but have a life-sustaining impact on the community that one finds oneself in. So these are all things that you don't just sort of innately have access to as a human being. These are programs of development. And even while these traditions in various ways affirm some kind of pre-existent divine knowledge or even identity, in the case of Hinduism, you have this proclamation of Tat Tvam Asi, thou art that. So there is something within the human being that is already connected and already realized in terms of the divine, but that is not identical with the individual subject ego, the sort of lower self, to again use these sort of Neoplatonic turns of phrase. So our modern cosmo-anthropologies of the human being really reduce the human subject to this lower level, to this ego personality, and even things like the Jungian perspective don't really get us this deep connection between human subject and super subject divine. You're still sort of trapped within some kind of human realm. So this is a very, very long-winded critique of what's going wrong with this picking and choosing sort of paradigm in terms of religion. And I think here it's actually powerful to bring up this metaphor often associated with traditionalism, this idea of the multiple paths up the same mountain, which is something that I've seen critiqued many times by those who oppose traditionalism, as it can be a trite metaphor. But I think if you explore it more thoroughly, it's actually quite robust. So when you're scaling a mountain, generally what you're doing is you're following a path that has been laid down and explored by human beings before you. And if you're on the south side of the mountain versus the north side of the mountain, the particular path and how it winds, what kind of landscape it traverses is going to be different. But the important thing is you are following this route that has been laid down, that has been given to you, and that is a mercy, a blessing. Trying to traverse a mountain that no one has gone before is going to be incredibly difficult and treacherous. And so that's kind of what's happening when you're doing this picking and choosing, is you're trying to chart your own course. So you're actually well, it seems like you're kind of getting some kind of idealized spirituality by doing so, you're actually putting more roadblocks in front of yourself in terms of actually getting to a destination, actually achieving some kind of deeper realization.
I'm so glad you brought up that analogy of the mountain. I thought it was really evocative and so accurate as well. And I think linking it to your further point, when you try to craft your own pathway up the mountain, so to speak, you are very much doing it on your own terms. You're trying to kind of sculpt it out in a way which suits your own dispositions and how, what kind of level can you climb and how can you personally get to the mountain. And that's not what it's about, because the mountain it's the highest peak. And that's an epistemological thing as well. It's the highest epistemic heights, and until we at the lowly level of the mountain ascent, we can't actually on the climb, on the gradient, we can't actually perceive what's at the top. So we have to sort of trust in it. And that trust is a huge element of following any traditional religion. It's about accepting that actually you don't know, and it's not always going to suit you and your personal dispositions. But that's sort of the point, because in order to go beyond that, you need to accord with something which is higher than yourself. Hasan, did you have anything you wanted to add on to that?
That's perfect. I wanted to actually make sure that you can hear me okay, because I just realized a short while ago that the input volume wasn't that great. No, that's beautifully said by both of you, both Jared and Esmé. Thank you so much. I wanted to sort of throw something of a spanner in the works, because I mean, let's just move. One of the challenges that the sort of traditionalist understanding of things faces, as far as I'm concerned, in this day and age, right, is the very real problem, which has always existed historically, but possibly more so today than ever before. And that's just my kind of intuition, just because spiritual masters are few and far between. Like, we don't have spiritual masters living next door to us anymore, right, or down the street. I mean, whereas in traditional societies, it was very, very common to be. My point being, you know, if there are fewer spiritual masters today, and this is my kind of conceit, that there are fewer spiritual masters today than there were historically, even say compared to 100 years ago, then what kind of demands are placed on these fewer spiritual masters, as more and more people are kind of demanding of their time, right, on the one hand, and B, what about the problem, the very real problem, again, which has no doubt existed throughout history, but I fear it's more problem today than ever before, the very real issue of spiritual abuse that happens at the hands of masters, which is a very real problem. Because if we are speaking of someone, like, we're talking about human beings at the end of the day, right? People who have attained without question, I mean, very often, and sometimes there are question marks without question also, but people have traversed the path, as the language goes, right? They've attained to certain levels of realization and so forth. Now, all of society, or significant swathes of society, say, you know, you are X, Y, and Z. Well, what's to say that that doesn't go to their heads, right? And this has been my fear. And I know that many people nowadays are coming out, and this is like, I'm kind of veering off the central topic, but just to kind of throw a spanner in the works, my sort of intuition has been for some time now that we need today, more than ever before, again, they have existed throughout history, more than ever before, we need women teachers and masters. I honestly feel, not that that's the only solution, but that will go significant ways towards remedying the situation. In my experience, I've been incredibly blessed to have had remarkable teachers, both male and female. And I would add, statistically speaking, I mean, based on my own sort of personal experiences, so this is very kind of, what's the word? This isn't sort of objective analysis by any means, right? But in my experience, women teachers, generally speaking, have a more sort of gentle and kind of less egoic approach. Anyway, this is like a whole issue, and we can like get into some of the questions that have been raised vis-a-vis traditionalists, and all, because I don't think the history, objectively speaking, I don't think traditionalists have a pure, like, you know, unsullied history. Like, that's just fact. Like, we have to be factual about things. Again, I don't want to, the traditionalists that we've mentioned, Schuon, Martin Lings, Nasser, and others. I personally knew Martin Lings, who was my teacher for a little bit, for a couple of years. I personally have known Sheikh Hussein, and through them, my knowledge of Schuon has come through them, and I owe them a lot. So I don't want to pretend, I by no means want to suggest otherwise. I think they have done tremendous service to the human condition, the modern human condition. General, of course, General's metaphor of the symbolism, or rather his sort of reading of the symbolism of the cross, I use all the time, the idea of the vertical and the horizontal interpenetrating. And this is, again, a very, very powerful, potent metaphor that comes up a lot in traditionalist writings, the idea of, the horizontal plane necessarily being pierced by the transcendent dimension, that we have the work that we have to do, the spiritual work that we have to do, is basically reintegrating the horizontal with the vertical. And all of that being said, there are some questions, I mean, I don't think there are simple answers to these questions, but I wonder if either of you had some thoughts in some of those things.
Right. Yeah, I think you've raised a number of important issues, and I'm glad we've sort of transitioned a bit to a more critical lens here, because I think it needs it needs to be explored. I think traditionalism is incredibly valuable as a perspective nowadays. I'd even go as far to say that taking on this kind of perennialist viewpoint is, from my vantage point, the only truly functional response to pluralism, religious pluralism, in our contemporary context. But from a place of caring deeply about this perspective, I think there are aspects which ought to be remedied, because even as these masters have provided so much to us, they are, again, human beings, as you mentioned, and with any grand narrative of history, no matter how much of value it does genuinely reveal, it's also going to be concealing other things. I think that that language of veiling is pertinent, from talking about these spiritual traditions where the veil is such a powerful metaphor. So I think some of the things that the traditionalists have veiled in their sort of overall narrative of religious history is, yeah, the abuse that can take place even at the hands of authentic spiritual institutions. And that's certainly a very pertinent topic in our contemporary times. I think, yeah, you can point to numerous examples in basically any large religious tradition of institutional abuse, and the traditionalists' perspective of really allying with the orthodoxy, really allying with the institutions that exist within religious spheres, definitely makes it more difficult to address these things at times. Their retort, of course, would be that, well, there's sort of resources within the tradition to respond to these things, that if these sort of leaders were genuinely following their tradition, they wouldn't be committing these abuses. And I think, while that all is valid and stands, I'm not sure that is the most powerful tool at our disposal for remedying these sorts of things. And so here is where I perhaps part company a bit more with the traditionalists, and thinking that things that we have gotten through modern philosophy, or through postmodern philosophy even, provide us with very, very powerful tools for addressing some of these abuses and some of these excesses of institutional and orthodox religion, basically. And where I would still stay with the traditionalists is, I would say that, well, if you're going to use some of these tools, you should still be grounded within a more robust traditional framework. Otherwise, it's easy to just drift off into the seas of nihilism, which are quite pervasive nowadays, and certainly a lot of these modern philosophies can lead one there. But I mean, you can look at some traditional symbolism and see how these things are perhaps not that much of a break from tradition. These are destructive tools that we have inherited from some masters of modern philosophical thought, and they must be wielded with wisdom. But the fact that they are destructive and corrosive and nihilistic, well, that's something you can see in some of the Hindu iconography, for example, with this idea of destruction and sort of the decay, and intentionally sort of allowing something be corroded, to be superseded is an important idea. So I think so long as we can utilize these tools with wisdom, I'm happy that they are at our disposal for the ends of creating better religion, basically, and preventing abuse.
That's beautifully put. Esmé, some thoughts, please, from you?
Well, I think I'm much more cynical about the application of, postmodern sort of filter onto these kinds of things, just because I think that it's a very slippery slope. As soon as you start taking a revisionist, constructivist approach, you're very liable to projecting what it is that you want to see from that religion. What do you want from that religion personally? And then, of course, we go back to the quandary of, well, what's the point in a religion if you're just going to kind of pursue your own path, which, as we've said, is never really conducive to any kind of spiritual success. Definitely isn't the right word. Progress. And I'm not against it, so to speak, because I think that it comes from a certain naivety for me to say that everything is completely fine with religion as it is. I don't think that's necessarily true. However, I think, while I don't fundamentally disagree, I just place much more caution when applying these postmodern approaches, because the problem is that, particularly with postmodernism, it is an antithesis to truth, right? Because the whole existence of postmodernism is the negation of the existence of absolute truth, and it's essentially trying to rework things which we believe to be true and make them about something secondary, like power or particular individuals and their own will. And I think this is hugely contradictory of the heart of religion and the heart of the Sophia Perennis, as we've talked about, which is capital T truth, that there is such thing as absolutism. So that's kind of my stance, which is a bit vague, I understand, but
I think that's a very fair stance. I would push back a little bit insofar as to say, in keeping with some of the things that Jared has said, that I genuinely believe that the traditions in their depth and breadth, and I don't want to, traditionalism with despite its incredible, some of these brilliant minds that we've described, despite their incredible brilliance, despite the incredible breadth and depth of studies and learning, they do not exhaust any one of the traditions that they're describing, right? And so any tradition, whether it's Eastern Orthodox Christianity, whether it's the Islamic tradition, whether it's Buddhism, Hinduism, that's a very problematic term, but on and on, any one of these traditions, historically speaking, they do have the mechanisms for self-correction. This has been my experience. This is, or at least, what I've learned through some studies. And, I think there's always room within a tradition. Like famously, the very quite famous prophetic tradition in the Islamic context is, the Prophet saying that wisdom is the lost riding beast of the believer. Wheresoever he or she finds it, he or she has more right to it. So there's this notion that, like, a tradition, because there's this assumption within a religious context, let's say, sticking with within the Islamic context, Muslims very commonly say, well, it's Quran and Sunnah, right? Does the Quran say this? Does the Sunnah say this? If it doesn't, then it's not. Well, the Sunnah does say that look outside of the tradition. I mean, the point that I'm trying to make here is, and another pretty famous tradition that the Prophet said, at the head of every generation, in another narration, at the head of every 100 years, there will come a renewer of the tradition. And some people have interpreted it as renewers. They're like a group of people. And so there's this notion that the tradition has to be, like new energy has to be put into the tradition, because what happens with anything that's institutionalized, this happens in single individuals. I think Jared and I were talking about this a little bit yesterday when we connected briefly, that there's a reason why we need new blood, right? In any context, in an academic context, in any sort of, because it's like new energy and new insights. At the moment any kind of thing becomes based on one individual, even a group of individuals, they necessarily, like, this is just the human condition. They'll do as much as they can. They could be absolutely brilliant. But like, I mean, I'm kind of going on and on about this, but because I've thought a little bit about this, and it is kind of quite important to me to think through, at least for myself. Like an example that I've used multiple times before in different contexts, which I'll use again, is the Ghazali's notion that he mentions in the Ihya Ulumuddin, in the sort of volume on Breaking the Two Desires. He talks about like how to treat the nafs, right? How to treat the lower self, and he sort of has this metaphor of like basically treating it like you would treat it a dog. Like he says, you give it a few bones and it'll stay happy. And I'm like, dude, I don't treat my dog like that. Like, I really lavish a lot of love on my dog. Like, maybe in Ghazali's time that made sense, right? Like in other words, there's things change contextually, right? I can't just give my dog some bones and keep it satisfied. Similarly, I can't just treat my lower self so poorly. Like, I will literally die probably, or God knows what. Like, so in other words, like the Sufi master in each context also knows, like in each historical moment, what the thing. And I'm kind of going on and on about this, but I think any sort of institutions are problematic. Like whenever something's set in stone, it's very difficult to critique it. And I think, to Jared's point, like something that I take from the sort of modernist / postmodernist sort of critique of institutions is there is an aspect of power which we can't deny. Like, if a Sufi master has X number of followers and he's considered like the head of the order, that dude exerts a lot of power. Some may say, well, rightly so, but I'm not convinced that it's always right. Like, even the prophet, the blessed prophet, he was open to criticism. Like right?
Well, maintaining humility is such an essential feature of what we've been discussing, even going back to the mountain analogy. You have to maintain this epistemic humility in the sense of not ever getting to the point where you go, okay, I have authority on this spiritual topic, or I have, kind of governance over this group of people, because that in itself is an indication that the nafs is resurfacing and that you are again becoming possessed by your ego. And so I would argue that once it gets to that point, once an individual is exerting that much power, then they have essentially taken a few steps back from their piety. I think we can agree on that. But with regard to what you were saying about context and the need for new blood, I think was the word that you used. I do agree with that in essence. I do, because I'm a strong believer that in order for the masses and well, for everybody to understand religious truth, they do need to have it communicated to them in a language which they understand. And Al-Farabi actually articulates this very, very well in the context of political philosophy. But I think that's worth talking about here. See, for Al-Farabi is definitely a kind of proto-perennialist. Actually, if you some of his writings, he's very insistent, for example, that Christianity is essentially the same truth as Islam, but just transmitted in a different way. And he's like this about many different aspects in terms of storytelling, in terms of politics. He believes that all of these things ultimately come from the active intellect, right, which is sort of related to the imaginal realm. It's an intermediary between the divine and between human consciousness and the worldly. But for Al-Farabi, in terms of, in order for that worldly to actually comprehend what is above it, it needs a collective imagination, it needs a collective language, it needs a set sort of canon of stories, of metaphors, which people can understand because it relates to them and their personal dispositions. So extending that to what we're talking about, I think that there is a need to keep things current and keep things relevant for individual people. And if that means maybe changing a way that the religion is presented, perhaps, or the stories or the allegories through which it's told, I think that's completely permissible. I don't think that that's in any way heretical. But I do think that one has to be ever so careful with changing. It's one thing changing the medium, but one has to be careful that you're not actually changing the truth, which is at the top of it. Which again, you kind of fall into a quandary, because if you claim that you know the truth, then again, you're assuming this sort of hubris. And I'm not going to say that I definitely don't know the perfect balance for that. God knows best. But this is what I feel we're really grappling with here. How do you have the best of both worlds, I guess?
Jared, some thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think there's definitely concerns in terms of balance, because there's certainly been excess in the 20th century, and really the entire modern period of trying to reinterpret and uh, uh, revise religion, that has been very destructive to the sort of holistic traditional character of these faiths. I think Christianity is probably at the foremost of that, but Islam is not far behind, with both the modernist and fundamentalist movements, which have sprung out in that milieu as well. But I do think, in general, the traditionalists are very conservative in terms of their reading of modern thought, and their basically wholesale rejection of any philosophical developments that took place outside of a traditional religious context, really post the medieval period largely. They'll say some nice things about the Cambridge Platonists and people like William Blake here and there, and certainly they do deserve credit. But I'm less conservative in my disposition, and I would say there's quite a bit in modern and postmodern philosophical developments that could be quite relevant. And these are not things that we should bring to the tradition to supersede it. This is not something we should try and replace the religion with. But I think these are things that can inform our interpretations of certain dogmas, certain practices, etc. And I'm less convinced that sort of this whole arc of development of especially Western human thought has been nothing but a descent, but a sort of a decadence. I think there's certain things you can find, and I think that the traditionalists would do well to be in deeper conversation with these sources, if nothing else, because I think merely diving in further would complicate some of their sort of very broad brushstrokes and be very valuable, because you know, I think especially stuff like uh, Heideggerian thought, certainly. And I see nowadays quite a few people who are rather Heideggerian and Platonic in disposition, really benefiting from having Platonism and Heideggerianism next to each other. And so I think it could fit well. Other things like process theology certainly could be an interesting ally and conversation partner. And yeah, there's been so much development in human thought, and I mean, it's just been incredible these past 100, 200, 300 years. So I think any very broad brushstrokes narrative is gonna miss things, and I think especially the sort of partisan traditionalists I see online, people who've found these authors and really latched onto them, really could do well to read a bit more outside of these core figures.
Well, no, I do agree with you on that, and I also think that it's easy to forget, you know, that these traditions themselves, they aren't. I think aspects of them are completely transcendental, and I think we shouldn't try and tamper with. But in terms of how a tradition is canonized, in terms of how it's formalized, institutionalized, there is always a human hand involved in that, and therefore there is some liability to corruption. I don't think this should be overstated, but I think if it's a matter of revising what has perhaps been, say, corrupted at human hands, I think that's more so what we should be focusing on. I don't think that that's inherently a bad thing. And that's you know, that's taking a very Platonic approach in itself. That's admitting that these universal truths do exist as a kind of logos form. They exist in an incorporeal, you know, atemporal realm, so to speak. And those things, those are eternal truths, and they can't be sort of critiqued and touched. However, as soon as those eternals become translated into the level of scripture, or even even institutional religion, I am aware of the fact that there are some discrepancies there, and there are, I guess, mistranslations almost. But that's about as postmodern as I'll go. And again, I think, yeah, I mean, I think my stance on this is quite clear, I suppose, or is it? I don't know.
Sure. No, my one sort of question to throw into the mix here then is, what would be the metrics for delineating between an authentic reinterpretation versus sort of a corruption of something that was originally pure? How can we separate those out? Because that seems quite difficult from my perspective.
Yeah, well, I think it's extremely difficult because there's always an element of human self-interest, and that applies to both sides. That applies to the compiling of the text itself and also the potential revising of it. And I think this sounds incredibly vague, but I think it's about keeping that submission entirely through the process, and about trying to identify what is my agenda when I'm approaching this religious text. And this applies to me in 2021, or somebody in the 7th century, transcribing scripture. You need to be very, very aware, I think, of your nafs and of what sort of ulterior motive you have, even if it's very kind of deeply unconscious. And I think in some situations that you have to it can be quite difficult actually, knowing you have to, sorry, I'm not elaborating this very well. But for example, it's about not trying to project your own priorities. And something which I think, a metaphor which is quite applicable to this in a sort of roundabout way is, are you familiar with Surah Al-Ankabut, the spider, the story of the spider? And there's a metaphor in there about the spider who, it's in reference to previous communities and individuals who have had messages from prophets and they've rejected them. And it compares them to a spider in a spider web. And it says, those who take protectors other than God are basically like spiders who build their own cobweb, but little do they know how frail this cobweb actually is. And I think this is a perfect analogy of what happens when human beings try and contrive their own structures and their own readings of religion, but also life as a whole. They become kind of enwrapped in their own gossamer, quite literally their own ideological gossamer. They have enwrapped themselves in this, and they are bound to it. And in the same way that a spider web produced by an 8-legged spider is octagonal in shape, the parameters of what you construct will be relative to that of you and your desires and your will. So I think that's very, very, something to be very careful of. And it's also quite telling that this metaphor is featuring in a context which is about heresy. Heresy, I can never pronounce that one. It's in the context which is about people who take protectors other than God. So do you see what I'm saying here? I think that's relevant in the sense that it's about maintaining this real consciousness of what are we actually trying to get to here? Are we trying to serve our own deeds? Are we trying to externalize what we want, or are we going beyond that?
Changing gears a little bit, and that's really brilliant, both of you. Thanks so much. Changing gears a little bit, could we talk a little bit about scientism? Because this is like the big ideology writ large. I mean, if there's one thing that the traditionalists have done very powerfully is, sort of make us aware in a very profound philosophical sense of the huge hubris of scientism as again underwriting the modern sort of Western and now global project, right, or projects. So can we speak a little bit to this? What is scientism? What are some of the critiques that traditionalists have? What is the sort of antidote to scientism? A sort of scientia sacra, right, a sacred science, as Nasser calls it, for example. Could we speak a little bit to that, Jared, perhaps, starting with you?
I think I'll pass it to Esmé.
Oh,
she's quite lucid on the
Please,
critiques
Esmé,
of our modern perspectives by the traditionalists.
Yeah, well, it's actually, again, very relevant to this imagery of the spider web, isn't it? Because if you limit yourself to an epistemology which is purely human, then you're only going to actually go as far as to be able to perceive that which is limited to the material realm. And this is generally reflective of modern science and even technology, as we actually touched on in our discussion on artificial intelligence, Hasan, is that when you're only studying, when you're only observing that which is contingent and that which is in constant flux, you're never able to penetrate anything higher than that level of contingency. And so while modern science definitely has its place in terms of experimenting for things with material effects, because it limits itself to a very peripheral mode of epistemology, which is empiricism, it fails to actually perceive the kind of underlying reality underneath that. And this is I think describing it as a hubris is the best way that one can put it, because it is this very, very bold assumption that human beings can know all there is to know. And this is something which before the Enlightenment was completely unheard of. I mean, pretty much every culture that I'm aware of has some conception of a very multi-dimensional epistemology, whereby there are different ways of perceiving. It's like Al-Ghazali, for example, has the epistemology of the heart. He acknowledges that there is such thing as empiricism, and he puts it in its place, right? But he also says that there is a kind of knowledge which is completely incomparable to this, and that is essentially light from God, which shines directly into the core of you, which doesn't require qualification, that doesn't require evidence, that doesn't require affirmation from the material senses. Because actually for Al-Ghazali, the material senses are actually flawed, because as Nasser touches on, if it's material, it can only comprehend that which is material, and that which is material is ultimately departed from real truth, right? Capital T. Yes, so I think that sums up my perspective. But Jared, please offer your insights.
Right. Yeah. No, that gets us started quite wonderfully here. Certainly, scientism is a massive problem at the root of many of the crises we're facing currently, especially the environmental side of things. So it's desperately needed to have a cogent critique of this kind of ideology. I really like how Houston Smith has articulated the sort of disposition of scientism as viewing nature as sort of the domain of man's control. So instead of approaching nature as sort of this luminous, even theophanic, sacred aspect of creation that we sort of naturally have a certain ethical disposition or responsibility towards, we end up viewing nature as mere resource for human progress, human development. And that is certainly disastrous. I really like this quote from Edward Abbey, the kind of quirky anarchist, environmentalist of the Americas. Cool guy. He says, "Growth for the sake of growth is the ideology of a cancer cell." And I think it's quite provocative, but I think he's entirely right there to look at the insidious aspect of pure growth for no higher purpose. I mean, if you sort of investigate what's going on in this sort of intersection of capitalism and scientism, perhaps the deepest sort of answer for the purpose of these things would be something like transhumanism, but that certainly has some scary dimensions to it from my perspective. Anyway,
can you say a little bit more about transhumanism? This is one of my too many obsessions.
Sure. Yeah.
Which I really want to have a longer conversation about.
Sure. I'm certainly no expert here, but it's this interesting philosophy that has developed in pretty recent times that there's some kind of human destiny beyond the merely human condition we find ourselves in right now. So it has interesting intersections.
Merely sort of biological human condition, right?
Yeah. So it has interesting intersections with things like futurology, and what is kind of interesting about it is it's reintroduced something of a teleology for human beings through a very modern or postmodern kind of perspective. So in that regard, I could almost view it as sort of a bubbling up of something of a traditional perspective in a completely different garb, and one which the traditionalists would certainly critique as counter initiation or something along those lines. But yeah,
because
certainly.
most not traditionalists, most transhumanists don't believe in a sort of metaphysical traditional
Right.
metaphysic, right? That they believe fundamentally that they can achieve. They're not only atheists, atheist
Hmm.
materialists, because interestingly enough, there are some people self-identify as Christian transhumanists, Buddhist transhumanists. I think I've seen one or two Muslim transhumanists. It's weird because the sort of the salvation that's envisioned by transhumanism and transhumanists is on this plane, right? To use the kind of
Hmm.
the
Hmm.
metaphor, the horizontal plane. So they believe they can achieve human perfection, biological perfection through technology, right? The idea that we've evolved as far as we can through the natural biological processes, right? And that the next step in our evolution has to happen through technology. And it's like the whole idea of brain-computer interfaces that Elon Musk is promoting right now with Neuralink and stuff like that. Ray Kurzweil is another major proponent of transhumanism. It's really dark. I actually wrote a paper about this a few years ago, which I completely sat on because I was being lazy, and often very lazy. And it's finally going to be published. But my kind of contention in that paper is that sort of transhumanism is basically a secularized religious. It's a religious impulse completely secularized, right? Because as human beings, to take the kind of Matia Eliadian perspective that we are homo religiosus, right? That we are fundamental, we have deep religious longings that we can never get away from. So if I mean to take that assumption on face, I mean to take that as true, which I do, then what happens if we take away the traditional religious kind of frameworks through which we view the world? Then we create our own gods, right? And ultimately, from a sort of traditional religious point of view, traditional religious spiritual point of view, the ultimate idol is the idol of the self, right? So if I can become immortal in this physical plane, if I can become godlike, through my integration into, and they literally, transhumanists literally use this kind of language, that we will become like gods. That they have this notion of the singularity, when if and when, and it seems like it's going to happen at some point, when artificial superintelligence is created, they literally say, people like Kurzweil, we won't know, we literally don't know what it will be like beyond that point. But anyway, I've kind of gone on about that, but clearly I'm obsessed with it a bit too much.
No, it's fascinating to go down these rabbit holes. Who would have thought traditionalism and transhumanism? I mean, fertile ground for some interesting dialogue here. I think transhumanism, like the political ideologies of the 20th centuries, is another sort of utopian vision that human beings have created, and it's a longing for salvation, in a sense, that is pretty intrinsic to human life. So I don't think it's at all strange or odd that such a thing has developed, but I think the problem with these types of utopian programs is you get some very scary dynamics where the ends will always justify the means. And certainly this is a problematic thing you can find in religious history as well, justified by various dogmas. But certainly the bloodshed we saw in the 20th centuries was unprecedented. And so I tend to be more terrified of these secular utopian programs than the religious ones that we have inherited. As there's something about having ultimate salvation exist in a realm or a plane that is beyond the merely human or the merely material, empirical cosmos that does to an extent safeguard some of this danger in having the ends justify the means, especially when salvation is ultimately dependent on in one way or another on faith, on belief, on religious practice, on good works. These sort of methods for achieving salvation seem to have fewer externalities than sort of implementing some kind of societal program or technological program to achieve the ends. So.
Well, this very dystopian vision that you're evoking here really reminds me of Seraphim Rose and his kind of comments on where modernity is heading, and he has a very quite sort of quite radical, I guess, worldview in some ways. But he sees this progression which began for him with liberalism. I'm not sure whether I agree with that, but perhaps not worth going into. He sees this kind of the foundations of all beginning with the Enlightenment fundamentally, and how this is kind of escalated into man having complete dominion over the world, and the inherent nihilism of that, because it's at that point that you completely give up on any notion of a higher order or anything, and it becomes purely about the actions of man. And I was just thinking about Seraphim Rose's description of what happens when ultimately nihilism takes over, and you have a government which is established by men and directly solely towards the ends of this world, and there is no higher aim than earthly happiness and worldly happiness. And this is essentially what we are aiming towards with transhumanism, right? Because it's this point where human beings have full dominion over the earth. And this is seen not just in transhumanism, but in just, it seems, every tech news item that I'm seeing at the moment. For example, some scientist, whatever that even means anymore, had created this fake sun, and they were saying, oh wow, we can put the sun anywhere we want now, and it was this sort of huge kind of glowing ultraviolet, probably like an LED light or something, a big sort of sphere, and they were proposing that we should have this at night because it helps our mood boost or whatever, and it can expose us to more light. And it's just sort of, well, hang on, we've already got that, haven't we? I mean,
here's one to ponder, to think a little bit about. Technologists and their sort of extreme hubris, right? They do all sorts of crazy things and want to do also. So Bill Gates, our brother Bill Gates, right? He's been funding these projects, I'm sure you've heard about, where literally they want to dim the sun by spraying the atmosphere with all these artificial chemicals. Like, this is not made up. This sounds like the plot of some really bad sci-fi movie. This is real. Like, there's some project, I think some scientists in Harvard want to do this. Like, Brother Gates, why? First of all, why? But secondly, who gave you the permission and authority to do this? Well, and this is the issue of power and money, right? It's I don't know. I think if we're uprooted from our sort of, to some of the things that you've both been very eloquently talking about, like religion talks about selflessness, right? Doing for others more than we do for ourselves. Like, we only need a certain amount to live, really. And they've studied, because they study everything. I don't know who they is here, but
scientists say. My favorite one was, according to science, heterosexuality is bad for us. So who are these scientists and who's funding?
This is the meme of the times, right? It's science. Is it though? What is science? Like, have people actually sat down to think about it, right? But
scientism, we know that. I mean, that it's a perfect example, isn't it, of this sort of absolute truth dogma, and it's becoming something which you can no longer dispute. And without wanting to digress too much into current affairs, I mean, this is something that we're seeing at the moment. If you doubt what mainstream science is saying is good for us, then you're somehow sort of, you automatically, you don't agree with science, you must be
the interesting thing is,
which is a heavily weaponized term, but maybe we shouldn't go
no, it's very weaponized. No, but I maybe won't dwell too much on this, because there are the very real issues of censorship now, which we have to be aware of. No, it's very real. But the fact of the matter is scientists themselves disagree all the time on all sorts of things. But somehow in the mainstream, and this is the issue of scientism as well, that there's this kind of myth that's invented about science being one thing, and it has the final say on everything. And it's very often underwritten by, very moneyed interests and things like that. But that's not all that scientism is, right? I mean, scientism is also significantly this notion that we can have an objective grasp on reality, right, on the material world, through our sort of through our five senses, shorn from an understanding of reality that is fundamentally grounded in a metaphysical understanding of things, right? That to one of your points earlier, Esmé, about Ghazali's notion of the five senses being ultimately limited, empirical sort of sense data ultimately being open to very real mistakes and things like that, and delusions. Whereas there's a type of objective truth, right, which comes from on high. That's very much akin to, of course, Saint Augustine's notion of, the light of the divine, the intellect, right? And sort of what traditionalists talk very, very powerfully about, I think also, which is worth mentioning, the difference between, the historic difference between reason and intellect, right? Intellection and reason, that now they're kind of equated, right? They're interchangeable terms. But reason is this kind of it's this sort of process, that we go through to figuring out, deducing things, right, and come to a conclusion about things. But the intellect is something that is a dimension of the human reality, which is inspired by the divine. Yeah. It's a place where the divine light shines, and ultimately it transcends reason, right?
Yeah, and to completely sever off any higher principle is essentially, it's a mark of ingratitude, I think, sort of given this full apparatus for essentially becoming familiar with God. I think that's essentially to take a very sort of Thomas Aquinas, Pan Aquinas approach, the idea of the ratio, that we've been given this gift of reasoning in order to perceive God, because it's an aspect of the imago Dei, being created in the image of God. We also possess this rationality from God, and that's incredibly important so long as it is coupled with this desire to seek God and not to use it as an end in itself. Yes, and I think perhaps maybe it's worth just going full circle and talking more about, or just going back to where we started, talking about kind of traditionalism as being a system, through which we are using our reason to discern God, through which we're sort of putting back into place the faculties of the human being to try and discern what actually is truth, and not just making up our own truths in this postmodern, kind of hyper hyper postmodern world.
Beautiful. And so we'll slowly wrap up. Maybe a couple of other ideas worth touching upon. The idea, not just the idea, the very sort of real practice and proselytization, to use that problematic word, vis-a-vis sacred art. Sacred art, of course, is a very, very important dimension of traditionalist writings, especially Schuon. Could we say a little bit about sacred art, please? Either one of you?
Yeah, I think one of the great contributions of traditionalist thought in terms of sacred art is showing how authentic art is sort of, it has a living dimension within practice and community. And I think especially the Eastern Orthodox tradition is exemplary in this regard, where the iconography plays such a central role in the liturgy itself, in having this space that is luminous and ordained, or sort of I have all the saints kind of all around, and angels, and Christ, of course, centrally. And it's not just artwork to look at and appreciate aesthetically. It has a deeper function, sapiential function, as Nasser would write, that it can bring you closer towards wisdom, towards realization, justification, even. And I think the Eastern Orthodox approach to icons, even in personal spirituality, having the icons in the home, relating to them very intimately, kissing the icon, it really goes to show how linked these sort of practices of love and sort of knowledge are within tradition. And certainly you see it in other traditions as well. I think Islamic calligraphy of the Quran especially it has a similar function. And I mean, certainly you're beautifying the word, the divine speech, and it's only very natural to beautify such a thing. If you believe the Quran to be God's word in one way or another, to put that on display in a beautiful way is, I mean, obvious. What else would you do? You're going to take deep care and present those words as luminous. And then when you do that, to recite a luminous text, to read it engraved in the wall of the masjid, it has an effect on a person that could not be achieved merely by, say, typed words on a computer. There's something more generated. There's this moreness. There's this mystery. I think perhaps even more so, that is evoked by the beauty that then makes you yearn to draw closer to that which you do not know at this point, and which you are always going to be drawing closer to. The mystery is never exhausted. And I think that is what sacred art does such an excellent job in conveying.
Well, that brings to mind Paul Tillich and the function of symbolism as this mediator. And again, I think we mentioned earlier the role of the active intellect in the imaginal realm, and these being things which sort of magnetize us towards God ultimately, and the Platonic forms, if you'd like to use more agnostic language. And art, by way of using symbolism rather than words, it appeals to this more when I say instinct, I don't mean in a sort of biological sense. I mean in terms of the fitra. I mean in terms of innate God consciousness is what I mean by that, the divine spark, so to speak. It rekindles that when we become acquainted with symbolism and become with the abstraction of beauty. It lifts up the soul, and it's very much the same with music. And I wrote an essay on this recently for Arab Lit Quarterly about the function of music, particularly in the medieval Arabic imagination, as being something which conjures unity through the synthesis of multiple sounds. And it's the same with art. I think the assembly of a picture, the different elements of a picture, all bring to mind a very set conceptual image or feeling, and that is itself, it's just a process of ascending by way of perceiving that and what it means. And again, tradition is very much, it belongs to this same realm, I think. Just to go back to come full circle, I think that tradition is about elevating, about using mediums which are particular to the human senses. It's about, tradition does appeal to the worldly existence, but again, it makes that worldly existence regulated. It's like, for example, festivals. They take one's life out of a chaotic state where everything's at sort of random times, and they put it into a set sort of organized, you know what I mean, like a kind of marked year or cycles. And even meal times, for example, are a way of reconciling with some kind of order beyond the chaos that is materiality. I think that may be a good place to wrap up, actually, unless there's anything else that we wanted to say.
No, that's perfect. I was just going to add a couple of comments as far as sacred art versus sort of profane art, right? Sean and the traditionalists in general, they talk about profane art's elevation of the lowest aspects of human nature, and that they come from a very egoic, that profane art ultimately comes from a very egoic place, where sacred art seeks to, in keeping with the general impetus of the traditions as such, it seeks to, as it were, diminish the ego and elevate the sacred dimensions of our being. So famously, historically, icon writers, right? The sort of people who painted icons, they called them writers. They would not sign their name under the art, and this was a very, very common practice, because it wasn't about the writer, it was ultimately about the divine reality that these forms, these sort of archetypal forms are harking towards, and they become actually very real windows onto the divine. It's not some make-believe, it's very real. When the Orthodox Christian venerates an icon, whether of Christ, whether of the saints, whether of whether of the Virgin, it's because they somehow, these icons in a very real sense, allow us to experience some of the, to make sort of spiritual metaphors here, experience something of the spiritual baraka of these tremendous figures. And of course, Christ is not just a figure in the Eastern Orthodox tradition. And I'm reminded also, by comparison in the sort of context of modern art, Guy Eaton, another traditionalist, Hasan Guy Eaton, who's British born also, like Lings, he mentions in a collection of his essays, sort of in writing about in writing about modern art, he mentions how he mentions the biblical story of Christ's taking the exercising this town, the Gadarene swines up, the demons are put in the sort of bodies of the swine, and then they end up going off the cliff. I think it's Christ. I forget exactly the details now. So in other words, the demons have to be exorcised from the town, right? And Guy Eaton's point is, in a modern context, the demons are plastered on canvases, and therefore everyone to imbibe and absorb. I think that's a very, very profound reading of the situation. And at the same time, I have a very sort of complex relationship to art as such. So it's like, I think any sort of generalized statement is going to have some issues, but one could say, as in keeping with the modern attitude towards nature, the modern attitude to how we live, the surroundings we create for ourselves, right? In a traditionalist context, in a traditional context, to take out some of the things, Esmé, you're mentioning, that the daily cycles, where we live, how we live, they're meant to be conducive towards remembrance, right? Of the divine, of transcendent realms and things like that. Whereas in a modern context, and this is not like just sort of traditionalist conspiracy theory, right? Like, this is very well known that modern cities are designed in certain ways to create certain sort of mental states, and like Nasser also makes this point that we have these roads ripping through nature, right, through the sacred, through sacred nature, which is sacred ultimately, ripping through it, for basically so that we can get products as fast as possible. And not just products, sometimes it's about munitions, it's about control. It's really about control. So this stuff is very well thought out as far as the dominant narratives are concerned, right? They serve the dominant narratives and the dominant interests. And anyway, so hopefully, well, what's the hope? Traditionalism can help us think through some of these very thorny problems that are not going away anytime soon. So, well, great. So thank you both. It's been a very, very rich experience talking to you both, and thank you so much for your insights and and your commitment, like to a sort of to a spiritual dimension of our being, which is very, very important. I personally definitely believe that we're more spiritual than not, and or religious, and whatever language you want to use, and to deny that aspect of our being, I think we're missing out in a major way. And whether traditionalism has all the answers, I know it certainly has some very powerful responses to a lot of the very real thorny problems. No, I thank you both for your contributions and thoughts and insights.
Wonderful. Yeah, this was incredibly fruitful and energizing. It was great talking on these important subjects with you both.
Thank you, Jed. Thank you, Esmé.